Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Mastering Retention Podcast. I'm Tom Hammond, your host and co-founder of UserWise. And today I am delighted to be with Miss Ruby Urlings, who is currently Director of Production at GSN. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, correct.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be super fun. We're going to get to talk about, game production and all sorts of fun things. Before we do that, though, I always like to start with, Ruby, what's your story? Like, how'd you get into games and to where you are?
Sure. I think I've got a fun story. I think I must have been about the age of 12, all right? And this was the time when Lord of the Rings was a really, trendy topic. The movies were about to come out. And at the time, I started, exploring the world of tech, and I started to explore web design because I wanted to make a website about elves. I was obsessed about elves. I did archery. I wanted to do everything Lord of the Rings related and create the best elf website out there. So what my dad did is he hosted a website for me. I started to learn HTML. And as I kind of got older and throughout the years, at one point, my dad comes to me and he said, Ruby, the hosting company just rang. And they said, we were out of limits for the package that we had because you're getting too much traffic. What are you doing over there? And I explained, well, I'm working on this elf site and I've got all these affiliate links to other elf sites. And here we go. And I have 50,000 visitors coming from the US alone. So at that point, I think me and my dad kind of, realized like, okay, tech is something that I'm into. Fast forwarding a little bit for you to, my university days, I figured I was going to be an engineer or programmer, depending how you want to call them. And I went to university to study game design and development. It took me about 2 weeks in the study that I realized I was not going to be a programmer and that coding, my elf side was completely different than coding games. But I was all right because at the time at uni, you had only 3 pathways really that you could pick from. You could become a game artist, which I knew I could never do because I'm not very artistically gifted. I could become a game programmer. Okay, so that was a dream that I wanted to end there. Or you could become a game designer. So for a moment there, I thought, okay, game design is the path to go. I think, I've got some skills. I was really into gaming, especially strategy games, Age of Empires, Civilization, those type of games. So I figured, let's give it a shot. And as I made my way through uni, you had to do the course of those 3 different lanes and then specialize. And at the end of the second year, we did something that I kind of refer to as idols. There was like this business jury or expert jury, professional jury that the school invited over. And what you had to do was present your game projects that you had worked on throughout the first 2 years of your university course. And that's when I met someone called JP van Seventer, very well known for the Dutch Game Garden in the Netherlands. And as I was presenting and I was showing him the stuff I was doing, he stopped me and I will never forget because he told me, Ruby, there's a name for what you're doing and it's called being a game producer. And that was the first time I had ever heard of what a game producer is, what they do. I had never thought about it because until that point, I've only worked on school projects and you could only be one out of the 3 paths. So, well, I learned about game production then and I've never looked back. So fast forwarding 10 years or so, well, 12, I must say, here we are.
So if you had to define what a game producer is and what they actually do, what would that be?
So this is a tough one. I always, joke about this when you're at a party or something and you're trying to describe what you're doing, right? So I summarize it in 2 ways. For me, game production is being a niche project manager where you have a lot of expertise about how games are developed that you apply to manage the game development team. But when you ask me, what do I do day to day? I just say I manage expectations. That's what I do. I talk to a lot of people. I get all their input and I, fast forward, spread the information and manage everyone's expectations. Yeah. That's the simplest I can do.
So are you guys fully remote, kind of in office? I'm curious, when COVID hit, how, having all those conversations and stuff maybe like changed for a remote company versus like an in-person company where you can just wander over to someone's desk and ask them how things are going or whatnot?
Yeah, for sure. I think I speak of, probably all game producers, that initially when we worked in office and then all of a sudden during the pandemic, you had to work remote, that was a bit of a challenge. I think luckily working in tech as a whole, the whole IT situation was relatively straightforward because we all work on computers, we can all dial into meetings, and that was a transition that was maybe slightly easier than for other industries. But you're right, it was mainly the desk conversations that, you were all of a sudden missing, walking by someone, seeing what they're doing, commenting on a fun animation or, anything that you see on screen. So we, my team anyways, adopted a couple of things that really worked for us. The first one was we encourage Slack calls, video calls, and just bringing people, having a bit of a chat, because yes, you can type to each other. Yes, you can send each other email or Slack message or a Teams message, whatever tool you're using, but it's not quite the same as just having a quick chat with each other. So that was something that really helped us trying to, keep the vibe alive, if you will. Second, I think what was important was to make sure that you facilitate enough meetings. Now, this is tricky because there's also such a thing as too many meetings. But it was definitely a transition compared to how we used to work, where we just needed to make sure that we've informed everyone.
Yeah. Do you find that there are maybe different game production methodologies that different teams use, that we could maybe like go through and talk about like the pros and cons of each of those?
Yeah, for sure. I'm quite passionate about this topic because I think if you ask any producer out there, what method or production method do you use? I bet you that 99% of them will tell you we work agile. Everyone will say, yeah, we work agile, we do Scrum or some adaptive version of that. Some might, work more Kanban than others. But recently I've completed an MBA. And I thought that was really eye-opening for me because there you learn about a lot more production or operation processes, it's called over there, that maybe are working in different industries that maybe are not so common in the game industry. And I realized that the reason we really like Agile overall, right, is because a lot of game design is unpredictable. At the end of the day, we're trying to make a fun experience. But what is fun? Right? If we could describe that easily and it was that binary to find what fun is, we could have made waterfall processes, streamline everything, and every game that we would create would be perfect. But that's not the reality, is it? So the reason we like Agile is because we can iterate, get feedback from either our own teams or users and keep repeating that until you find the fun. However, on the flip side, I argue that there are a lot of things that we do day to day that actually aren't that unknown or aren't that unpredictable. Like, let's take an example. If you were to work on a match 3 game, what do you know you need to do? Create match 3 levels. You need to do that. You need to do a lot of them. Or let's say we're working on a bingo game. What do you need to do? You need to create a lot of bingo rooms. Maybe you're working on, let's say, a fashion game. You need to create a lot of outfits, a lot of dolls to dress up. Mm-hmm. So there are things that you just need to do en masse, right? And I realized that a lot of the manufacturing industry has a lot of success with lean methodologies. A lot of these methodologies originally came from like the car manufacturing industries, particularly Japan. You've got examples such as Kaizen or Lean Six Sigma. And basically what those processes are trying to do is they're not trying to drill down necessarily on what the fun is, like the unknown. They're trying to perfect producing something. So you're mass producing your levels. So what you're trying to do is you find a process that you keep on perfecting and perfecting and perfecting until you do it better and faster and more efficient. So here we go.
Yeah.
Two different methodologies, two different problems.
I love it. So maybe before we delve into those, for listeners who maybe aren't aware, can you just give like a high level definition of what the agile methodology is, kind of how it works day to day, if they maybe haven't, taken part of that, and then we'll do the same for the lean methodology after that.
For sure. So the agile methodologies came from software development. So they all started with the assumption that you wanted to work in small increments and work together as a team to build and build and build and build in small iterations versus what used to be the predominant production method, which we refer to as waterfall. Now, just for a bit of background, what the waterfall methodology would assume would be that first someone designs what the game needs to be, hands it over to the next team, which might be the art team, to create the art for it, who hands it over to the tech art team, who implements the art, who hands it over to tech to build the mechanic, program the feature. Then it goes to testing, and then you would be done. The original methodologies before Agile would just assume that you did that for your product and you had a very defined starting point and a very defined end point. And as long as you followed the process, you're going to have a perfect product. Now, for software, and more particularly in games, that was exactly what the problem was, because unfortunately, we cannot define upfront what the entire game design needs to be to make a fun experience for a user. So Agile was, adopted for that reason. It did not necessarily remove those dependencies between the departments that I just mentioned, but what it did do was it breaks down certain steps or certain iterations, we call them, that you want to make to the game and efficiently run the team. So how that typically looks like is a sprint process. Sprints, depending on where you work, can last anywhere from maybe 2 weeks to up to 4. And they start with planning what you and the team want to tackle that sprint. You make a list of all the to-do items. And then as the sprint starts, you do your daily stand-ups. For every day, you inform each other about what's happening. What are you working on? Do you need any help? And you repeat that process until at the end of the sprint, you hopefully have closed majority of your tasks. That is the plan. You play that together. You note, any future changes that you want to make. You add them to the backlog and you repeat. That's the core fundamental agile process that a lot of the game teams use.
Yeah, that's great. And how about the lean methodology for people that maybe are less familiar? I assume more game teams are familiar with Agile, but how about this lean thing?
Exactly. So what lean does, it's interesting. You're trying to first find something that is a process, okay? So it's something that you need to do repeatedly. Now, maybe for the sake of this, conversation, let's assume we're making that match 3 game and we're making match 3 levels. So the first thing that lean does is defining all the steps or stages that you need to complete before you have a match 3 level. Okay, so let's say that we have found a process and we're assuming that we found 10 different steps in that process. What the lean methodology is trying to do is trying to see, do those 10 steps produce a consistent outcome? Or can we improve the outcome, which is the ultimate goal? Whether that's being faster at creating a level, whether that's creating a more fun or better quality level. That could be, different goals that you have in mind. And lean methodologies have different options to achieve that. One of them, and I know this sounds scary, is called statistical process control, SPC. Yeah, it sounds really scary. Don't worry, I'm going to simplify
sounds pretty
it.
Scary, yeah.
Yeah, don't worry. It's not as scary as the name might suggest. Basically, what you're trying to do is, with the SPC methodology, is make it or make an observation on whether your process is in control, which basically means, do we at the end of the process produce that match 3 level? Because if we don't, then there's obviously something wrong with the process itself, right? If we don't even have a level at the end. But assuming that we're in control, how precise and how accurate can we be? Now, a lot of people might, struggle with that definition. So one way I like to explain it is, let's say that we have a bullseye, okay? And in the center of that bullseye is the perfect match 3 level. right? Let's say that that's our goal. You want to create the perfect match 3 level. That's super fun to
What
play.
is the perfect match 3 level? Like because I feel like there could be a whole slew of definitions in each match 3 level. I don't know. I feel like, some of them, like the super hard levels, my goal is to actually monetize on the +5 moves. Other levels are about introducing a new mechanic. So, if I'm thinking about match 3, and maybe I'm delving too far into the details here, but if I'm producing multiple types of match 3 levels, would I kind of have a perfect bullseye for each of those different types with the particular goal for that level, whether it's like easy
Correct.
or introducing a new mechanic or whatnot?
Correct. So you will need to find an abstract way to find out what would perfect look like for me. Okay. So for a match 3 level, you could argue, okay, it needs to monetize with this certain KPI in mind. It needs to have this certain engagement KPI, whatever your goal is that you want to achieve, right? This varies per team, this varies per department, this varies per game probably. So it's more about the abstract concept of trying to find something that you are happy with, okay? The process is trying to have an outcome that you can define that you're happy with. So let's say we want to have that match 3 level in this instance where the completion rate of our users is 70%, right? I'm just making that up for the sake of this conversation. Now, okay, the first question that the SBC methodology is measuring is, okay, without going too mathematical, do we even hit the board, right, of the bullseye? Maybe not we're not maybe in the center, but do we hit the target in the first place? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Let's assume that we do. Most processes, and I'm going to give you a heads up, and it's a bit of a spoiler for those of you who will eventually calculate your own SPC, you will hit the board. Okay, because the fact that you have a process usually predicts that you have an outcome that is close to what you want. It's not always the case though, but majority of the time. Now, we just don't want to hit the target just for the sake of hitting the target. We want to get to that bullseye, right? So then there's two concepts that I think people could wrap their head around, is being accurate and precise. Now, let's say that if we took 10 shots at creating a match 3 level, whether that's 10 different people or one person 10 times in a row, for the sake of this example, that does not matter. But we do that 10 times. If all those 10 arrows that we're shooting at this bullseye are in the same spot, okay, that means we're very precise. So whether that's in the bullseye or not, that does not matter at this point. But as long as they're grouped close together, that's a good sign. Because let's assume that we did that, then all we need to do is we need to move that closer to that bullseye into the center of the target.
Yep.
If we were hitting around the circle of the target, really close to it, we could be accurate, right? So we're getting closer to that perfect level, but there might be some variation there. If we really want to hit the bullseye, we need to be precise and accurate at the same time. So all our arrows need to fly together and hit the circle. And in a nutshell, what the Lean methodology of SBC is trying to do is trying to help you optimize your process until you hit that spot.
Interesting.
Any questions so far before I go any deeper? I know that's a lot to digest.
So it reminds me of when I went to Boy Scout camp way back. There was like a shooting range, and to get the merit badge for that, you had to have 5 shots within, it was either like a quarter or a dime. So you had to have the consistency, and you had to do that so many times to get the merit badge. But it sounds like basically with Lean, ultimately we want every shot in the center of the bullseye. But before we maybe get there, the first thing is, can we consistently produce the same result of, let's say, a level that has a 70%, completion rate, over and over and over again? Then we try to figure out, how do we get that to the centerpiece, which is maybe creating a level with a 10% completion rate, over and over and over again, kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's right. One thing that I've used this for myself, which I would highly, recommend, I'm very enthusiastic about it, was to work with my teams on what our completion rate of a sprint was. So a different way of measuring velocity. Okay, if you are unfamiliar with what velocity means, it's something that our producer friends use, trying to predict how well we do with the work that we had planned versus what we completed, and at what pace we burn down through the work. You might have heard of burn down charts as well. Now, the reason I initially started to build a case for trying this new SPC method out for sprint completion rates over velocity was because velocity represents a lot of input from the team to daily update all their tickets, daily update all the hours that they spent on a certain task. And it's very bureaucratic and very, manual to do.
Yeah.
And with that come a lot of problems, especially what happens is if people know that you're measuring that, and I'm not, pointing at anyone in particular or any company in particular, but what happens is that, these shift because you want to make sure that you hit your targets and that the targets look good. It's very hard to just say, is this team working well based on estimates and hours that you get back? So that's why I thought that was a problematic metric to use, because it doesn't tell you if your game is getting any better. It just tells you whether people are good estimators or not. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
So I was looking for an alternative way.
And I didn't think about that too. I do know that, one of my past jobs where we had like log our time or whatnot, I might have increased or decreased the time based on what I thought the expectation was, in terms of what you're spending your time on and stuff like that. And, maybe it wasn't drastic, but if you're trying to accurately use that stuff and measure it, I mostly am, I just want to look like a good employee. And so
exactly. And it's natural. Yeah, and this happens a lot. And I've seen this, throughout my career in different teams. And it's not with bad intent. It's trying to, well, probably people trying to manage our expectations as a business, trying to, predict something that would be something that the company is willing to hear. So how I applied this SPC method to that sprint completion rate was, for me, I set a certain target of how many goals, I call them, we wanted to complete as a team per sprint, because we wanted to combine it with working agile, because we're still having tasks in our sprint that are unpredictable and hard to, know whether this is going to be fun, as a summary. So we set a certain percentage that we had in mind, and from there I started measuring. And what I very quickly learned was that there were different reasons why we couldn't make a certain sprint goal. And some people, this is another, terminology that you might not know. We made a fishbone diagram, a root cause diagram, Ishikawa diagram,
I haven't seen a fishbone in a long time. Oh,
I know. So it's like flashback, but it is a tool basically where as a team, you sit down and you try to come up with every reason why you think a process might not have the desired outcome. So what could, cause you to not make a sprint as a team? Various reasons. So on one end, it could be technology going down, or, if your computer breaks, well, then you need to wait for a replacement. Boom, you didn't hit your goals. Now, that might be a bit uncommon, but maybe sickness in the team. Okay, well, that could be a certain percentage that you keep in mind. Perhaps you don't make your goal because some of the specifications weren't clear, right? There was a lot of back and forwards, and that is time consuming. So you make a whole list of, what those reasons could be, and the whole team participates in trying to find those kind of problems. And as you know about those problems, you can obviously start to address some of them. Unfortunately, you cannot really address, people getting sick or computers breaking down, but you can take some measurements of, creating buffer or things like that to make sure that you cope for those unforeseen things. And by applying the SPC methodology and by comparing the completion rates, which was my target, right? That was my bullseye. I wanted to hit X percentage of sprint completion every sprint. Over time, you start to see that you're becoming more and more precise and accurate. and it's a really nice way to over time measure. But what it does warn for, and this is why, I will skip the mathematical part, but the mathematical part is important. It's trying to figure out whether you had an outlier of a sprint or not. And I think that concept is best to, compare it to a machine. Let's say we have a machine shooting at that target, trying to hit the bullseye. If one arrow flies out slightly more than the rest, you're not going to recalibrate the whole machine. If 99% of your arrows is in the right spot, you might, just see, okay, let's do another 1,000 shots and see where those will land. But that is something that production particularly is very sensitive to immediately react and immediately try to fix a problem that might just be an outlier of a special sprint. And I think that's really something that I recommend to producers out there and wider business folks. Not always overreact when something goes wrong. Double check, is this an outlier, yes or no? Before you change the whole process that might be working just fine.
Yeah. So do you feel like you have a recommendation of like using Agile and Lean together, or?
Yes, that's right. Yes. So in my perfect world, they are married. You don't, if you speak to any consultant, whether it's an Agile consultant or a Lean consultant, they will both say you should follow their methodology to a T. And if you do it via the textbook, you're going to have great results as a company. Unfortunately, that's not that simple. I think what I have done is combined the Lean for the processes that were straightforward and that were predictable and that were produced in mass, like creating certain amount of assets that were just a repetitive task that you need to do in a row to get through a whole batch, with that of Agile. And Agile usually applies to new features where you're going to try to find the fun.
Gotcha. So probably the biggest bang for my buck and the area that I should really focus on with Lean is to figure out what is the thing that is I'm gonna say like the biggest treadmill part of my content production. So if it's a match 3, it's probably match 3 levels. If it's Clash of Clans, it's probably new buildings or new troops or something like that as they kind of release them. Okay, so figure out where that point is, and then try to figure out the consistency and how to improve that over time.
Yes.
Do you think that well, let's say I have heard that Lean, I don't remember if it originally came from the like Honda creation, but kind of over in Japan in the
that's right
when they created the cars, and they had really like creative uses where they would like change up their machinery to like create different parts of the cars, and they reuse a whole bunch of stuff, which was very different than Henry Ford, the traditional line that went through. So when I think about content treadmill in games, which is something that is on a lot of people's mind of how do I keep up with these players, because it seems like no matter how much you produce, like players are going to eat through that before you can keep up with them, right? Content reusability, does that become a part of like Lean at all, or different ways that you think about like how do I get the most bang out of this content that I'm creating?
Yeah, for sure. I think Lean really comes down to how can you streamline the content that we have and get the most out of it. So how can we perfect it? So it's about perfecting what you have. Whilst on the other end, if we look at Agile, it's more about finding answers for emerging expectations and that you might find by exploring how users behave. That's the biggest difference that you can see between the two different methodologies. But in games, we have both, usually.
Would you say that using more of an Agile approach earlier in the game process, like as you're just creating prototypes, getting into soft launch kind of a realm, it should be more on the Agile side because you haven't got to the point of producing all the content?
Yes, I think so. I think that makes perfect sense. unless you were to create a skin of a game, right? So let's say you have a certain type of game where, you know, you're replacing the whole art layer, then of course that is more of a lean production heavy type of game that I know that a lot of people out here, you know, are looking into. But if you come up with a brand new game with brand new features, you got to experiment more before you can start streamlining.
Gotcha. Okay, that is very interesting. For folks that are maybe thinking about trying this, we've kind of talked about some of the pros. What are maybe some of the cons that would come from, you know, trying a lean methodology when they're, you know, traditionally used to this agile?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, you know, that you would need to be kind of guarded for, I suppose. One thing that you should not conflict is, even though you apply lean, and let's say that you're booking great success creating those match levels or creating assets or whatever, you know, your application might be, it does not necessarily mean that that's the right thing to focus on as a team. Okay, what I mean by that is there might be still more beneficial things to look into as a team than mass producing assets, for example. People, you know, get sometimes so caught up at KPIs and perfecting, you know, oh, we did more than last time and even better and even faster, and it was great with, you know, a brand new process, but perhaps the time is spent better experimenting. And people get a lot, sometimes get a bit too far creating a lot of content or a lot of things before they actually know that that content is what the user wants.
Yeah. So essentially, if you don't know what your bullseye is for this piece of content, it probably doesn't make sense to try to optimize for that, because you're just, you know,
yep,
you don't know what you're optimizing for. You need that North Star that you're shooting for. That makes sense. Have you gone through that process at all ever?
What do you mean by just testing out the different
Well,
content?
yeah, like, have you started to try a lean process at all yet?
Yes, so we have lean processes, yes, that we're working on, and those kind of emerged. You know, I don't want to go into too much details, so unfortunately, but those come from a lot of user research. That is key. Like, you need to validate that whatever it is you're doing, whether it's art content or gameplay content, that this is something that really resonates, because it's a often heavy investment to invest in that content pipeline or in that art pipeline. So if you're going in the wrong direction, that is wasted effort. We have gone through that. It was successful, but of course, you know, it is still games, and customer demands change. So it's an ongoing process. Unfortunately, you will never know for 100% for sure this is what the user wants, and then you're golden. I wish we got to that point, but too much happening in the landscape.
Yeah. Or maybe here's a question. What's maybe one of the biggest mistakes that you've made with either agile or implementing lean, you know, with your teams, where you know, you learn some lessons, and maybe here's how you do it in the future to avoid those mistakes happening again?
Sure. I think something that I did when I was just starting out in my career was I really tried anyways to follow the textbook of any methodology, because I thought, this is how I've learned agile, you know, I did my certified courses and this is how I meant to be doing it. And I think you'll soon realize when you're trying to apply that in real life, that not all these methodologies actually work for you and your team, and that there isn't actually a team in the world that is perfectly nailing every single detail that these processes prescribe. You always will need to make some adaptations. And people see these, you know, processes that agile or lean prescribe as gospel, right? Trying to follow it perfect. But in reality, game development or any real life is slightly more complex. So you should see them as tools trying to help you make better games. But the goal is not to fulfill the methodology, because that doesn't necessarily equal a perfect game at the end.
Yeah.
That would be my advice. Focus on the game.
That's great. Thinking just a little bit higher, just as a producer, what are some things that you've been able to do with your teams over the years that have made them more efficient and better able to actually, create the outcomes for players, which is what we really want?
Very good question. I think the facilitation of communication is clearly something that I'm proud of, that is very beneficial. I always joke that it's hard to measure, right? It's really hard to measure whether one producer is better than another, or what our impact is in the first place. But usually the first things that you'll see if a producer, is not there, or if there are not enough producers, is that communication usually starts lagging behind. Because one thing that tends to happen, especially in multidisciplinary teams like ours, is that people become, stuck in their bubble. Artists will look at the art world, and tech is in their little tech world, tech art is in the little tech world, tech art world, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's our role really trying to, make sure that the communication between these departments is flowing to the best of our abilities, and make sure that they're, being considerate of each other.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you find, so, for me, I actually started, when I started my first company, I struggled to find a technical co-founder. And so I taught myself how to code, and I built it all. Now, I am a very low to mid-tier, developer. Like the people we have now are much smarter, much faster, much better. You don't really want me touching code. But it's very valuable that I've gone through the process of learning how to code and learning how to think about, doing code and stuff like that. Because now if I have an idea or I have a request for, a developer, I can at least at a high level go, yeah, that'll probably take 2 minutes or 30 seconds, or that might take 3 months. Do you find that encouraging teams to go a little bit more cross, say genre, but cross role? So your artists learning a little bit more about the programmers, your programmers learning a little bit more about the artists, and how they actually link up the art and the different pieces like that, so that you just start to have a better understanding of how each different team kind of works and how long things take and those different elements?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend that there's at least some fundamental understanding, especially, for your more senior level staff and leadership staff, to have some understanding about what the main complications are of how your department impacts another. So, for example, if you are working in the art team, and let's say you're working on animation or UI, I think it's a very critical critical skill to understand how the tech team will eventually help to implement and work with your work. Because what I often see, I think this is maybe a little bit, by nature, of course, the artists are going to try to push all the boundaries to make it look as beautiful as possible. That's exactly what we're asking of them. The tech team wants to write as most efficient and clean code as they possibly can. And then there's a business that throws some deadlines on top that are trying to hit together. So making trade-offs and knowing in advance what causes more or less work, or what's harder or easier to implement, I think is really useful. But that also goes the other way around. When tech, needs to understand that, of course, art needs to have at least a certain quality level, and we cannot just rush in, everything that just is created within a single day, because the game needs to have charm. It needs to attract players. It is equally important. And I think the best teams that I've seen have got a really good understanding of both sides.
Gotcha. So I want to spend our last few minutes speaking about probably one of the most fun topics, is something that I struggle a lot with. Anytime you've got a live game or product or anything, you probably have 400, 1,000 open tickets of things that you can do. And maybe you get a roadmap and you've got your big features outlined and stuff. But you're always hearing from different users of the things that they want, be it quality of life things. You've got crashes that are happening. You've got, maybe execs that are learning things and coming down and wanting you to like do this thing ASAP. What's your process for handling all those things for maybe someone that's like struggling with this right now and figuring out what are the things that we can actually do in this, let's say, sprint right now,
Sure.
to work forward?
Ooh, interesting question. So there is an ideal theoretic solution and there's a reality solution. So just for
Let's hear
fun,
both.
the theory is, of course, depending on which prioritization method you pick, you would hope that when you gather all that feedback from your users, from your stakeholders, from your peers, from the team, that you can apply a certain prioritization method to it, and then simply you would work on whatever is on top of that backlog, on top priority. Unfortunately, in the real world, for producers, it often doesn't really work like that. And the problem usually is dependencies. Okay, so let's say that we have all agreed that if we only added feature X to the game, then all the biggest problems would be solved and everyone would be happy. Let's assume, it's never that simple, but let's assume we agree. The reality is that we'll first need to be going through your game design, your UI UX, your art team needs to have a path. Maybe some of this can happen in parallel, but there's a certain flow to things before it can, be engineered, tested, and shipped. So often what happens is I've got like stakeholders that really want something done and are wondering why we're not coding this right now, or is this not going in the game right now? It's because, well, we have nothing ready. We have no details ready to build this for you right now. So I wish I could do this, but reality is there's other work that is ready to work on. So that's what we're doing. And that's, like I mentioned, the expectation that you got to manage. It takes time to go through the funnel. And it's not always worth it rushing and going straight to engineering and trying to get it into the game. It's too complicated to make a game.
Yeah. So really it's just about expectation setting and, making people realize that, hey, love to do this, but the reality is we're not ready to do this kind of a thing. Have you ever used a process? Like I've heard of some game teams, what they'll do is they'll say, okay, what is the biggest problem that our game has right now? And let's say it's midterm retention from like day 7 to 14 or something like that. So I've identified that that's the biggest problem and that's what I want to fix. Then you can come forward and you put together all these different ideas of what you might do to fix that or improve that, I should say. And then I've heard of them kind of creating different columns for like technical complexity, chance of success, time frame, whatnot, and you kind of rate the values and you come up with, okay, this is the winner. It's going to take a medium amount of time, but have the highest likelihood of success or whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. I have seen teams that did that. That's right. And you can, some people, or in certain teams, we have rated some of these items on 1 factor. Some have rated them on 5 factors, all varying from time, effort, complexity, unknowns. You can come up with several parameters trying to rate these and predict what their impact is going to be. But at the end of the day, your production problem usually remains the same. Yes, you will get a certain list of priorities out there, but unfortunately, you usually cannot do it all at once. It still needs to, get some proper thought and specification before you can start implementing. I think one thing that was really helpful that I've had in a live game in the past was we had a game where we had a lot of incoming live problems. Okay. And of course, those usually got prioritized right away because they were blocking real users from having a great time. Now, we kept having to pull developers for new features and improvements that we thought were going to be great for the game off to help and hot fix a lot of these problems. And that could only go on for so long because there was always a fire, right?
Mhm.
And one thing that I highly recommend is if you're in that position, try to find and see if you can split your team in a pod or a lane, some people call them, where you have people
Yeah.
that are dedicated to a problem, let's say life issues. In your example just now, you could have a team that was midterm retention. You could have a team that's focused on the onboarding experience, the first time user experience. And if you group people like that, it's slightly safer to assume that you can predict their workload and roadmap because they're isolated. And this is something that Ed Catmull also wrote about. He was the president of Pixar.
Mhm.
And I thought it was interesting when he first, introduced this concept. He was talking about movies, of course, animated movies, but he said that they were creating specific teams for particular tasks, and they would not allow people to borrow from one team or another. Because if you think about it, most of the time when there's an urgent issue in your game, you pull your brightest heads together and you're trying to fix it as soon as possible. And oh my gosh, but that is very disruptive for whatever these people were doing. They could come from completely different teams. So what Ed Catmull at Pixar did at the time was he was trying to limit that borrowing, if you will, of people. And he found that it made people in his team more creative, because if you're the one that needs to fix your problem, well, you're going to find something, right? And therefore, there was also less disruption for all the other teams working on their own individual things. So that is something I would recommend as well. I've seen this successful in one of the live games I was at. Divide your team, especially when you're live. There's always going to be a hot issue coming in. So make sure that you dedicate people to deal with that.
Yeah. I've heard of some teams that will do things like, hey, we're going to dedicate 20% of our time towards player quality of life issues or crashes or things like that. So like every Friday,
sure,
we just focus on fixing those things. Like, have you seen that work well?
I have seen it. I have seen examples where there was like a certain bug fixing day. So there would be, a Friday or a Wednesday where people were only fixing bugs. I think that works particularly well if you're not live yet. If you're in early development, it's a nice way to keep your code clean and make sure that you groom it from time to time. But to be quite honest with you, I personally prefer when these kind of periods are near the end of a milestone, where you have dedicated time right when you build all the features before you need to deliver, that you polish things up.
Yeah. So, in this case, would you almost recommend having like a player quality of life or crash little team
Yes,
where their, focus is just those? Yeah.
I would.
Okay. So
we have had that in the past where people rotated as well. So not every team member loves, that hot seat, because usually, especially with life issues, that's a very, pressing matter.
Yeah.
So we had people, that rotated within that team, and that works too. You can plan that from, a couple of sprints in advance and find people that, will be in that seat for a while before someone else takes over.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we're pretty much out of time here. So I got like one more question and then one unofficial question for you. For creating these small little teams, let's say for someone that's focused on the onboarding experience, like what roles or people do you need to have like at a minimum in that team to be able to be sufficient and be able to execute on your job?
Oh, it is a very good question. It depends a little bit on what the core focus is. I definitely recommend it's less so about the roles, but more about the function. So I would definitely recommend that there's an owner of that objective, right? This could be a product person, this could be a game designer, this could be a producer, but someone who owns and leads that team, okay? Then slightly depending on how complex this objective is and the solutions that are on that backlog, you want to include your artists, your engineers, your tech art, and of course QA should be in every one of them, just making sure that we're developing according to our standards. But it varies depending on what kind of solutions you want to implement.
So probably like at least 3 to 5 people, your owner, your developer, and your artist kind of a person, assuming that artist can also do some of the technical stuff, and QA is always a part of stuff. Okay.
You want to make sure that it's a self-sustaining team. That's what matters. So depending on what kind of objectives you give them, as long as you've got every department covered, that would work.
That's great. Well, awesome. So I have one last question, because we are on the Master Retention podcast, of course. And Ruby, that is, what's one tip or trick or lesson you've learned over the years to increase, player retention or regularity? Like, how do you keep your players coming back, each day, each week, month by month, year by year, etc.?
The one tip, let's see. From my point of view, always the biggest thing that's going to make them come back is understanding what makes it fun for them. I think this might sound like a very straightforward advice, but it's actually more complex. I see this all the time where we're developing games and we're having an assumption of what's going to be fun. And we sometimes over game design of how this feature will work or how this game will work. And we're putting so much effort into it. And then we let people play it, and they play in a completely different behavior than we were expecting. They're playing and they're having a good time, but they're making their own little fantasy about why this is fun. And if you discover what that is, and you obviously cultivate on that, that's what is going to keep them coming back.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Ruby. If people do have questions for you, is there a good way for them to get in contact with you?
Yeah, for sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. You find me under Ruby Urlings, and I'm happy to help you with any production questions or any inquiries there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you.